Hello and welcome back to MBV. I'm Casper, and today we're going to do something a little bit different in that rather than replacing parts, we're going to be talking about how to determine what parts need to be replaced. In this specific example, we'll be talking about a very unusual problem I recently had with the 1967 Mustang and the process I went through in attempting to diagnose it and what the problem actually was. So stay tuned. So recently, I had a problem with the 67 Mustang when I was taking it into town for a test drive. I was just driving it into my office and the car was running great. I had recently installed the new Sniper EFI system on it. I had done some basic tune-up items, but other than that, nothing significant had changed on the car. So as I approached the second to last stoplight before my office, I attempted to pull away when it turned green and the car went wide open throttle, lit up both tires, left a huge cloud of smoke, and was running all the way to red line until I bumped it into neutral. I expected that something had broken that caused the throttle to go wide open, and as soon as I went to neutral, it was just going to peg itself out and I was going to have to kill the ignition. Instead, as soon as I bumped it into neutral to prevent the car from taking off, the car dropped right back to idle and ran perfectly. So now the question became, how can a car go wide open throttle only when in drive and idle perfectly in neutral? So as I got to the next stoplight, I stopped. Fortunately, I go into the office before any sane human beings awake, so it's about 4:30 in the morning, so there's nobody around. At the next stoplight, I have it in drive. It's idling perfect at the stoplight. I touch the throttle, the car goes wide open, takes off, and I have to bump it into neutral again. And again, as soon as it comes back down to idle, it's fine. I'm able to just let it idle around. I let it idle and was able to make it idle up my parking ramp into my parking garage, parked the car, went downstairs, and was completely baffled. So I went back and forth with this problem for a day or so because I didn't really have time to go deal with it in the parking garage. I would go up, look at a few things here and there, come back, and give up. My conclusion was there must be something giving it far too much air or far too much fuel that is then compensating in some way. The only thing that had changed on the car was the addition of the Sniper EFI unit in place of the 4-barrel carburetor. Now, the Sniper EFI unit is an extremely simple unit. It is essentially a throttle body with injectors in it, a computer, an O2 sensor, and a map sensor. The way it works is the amount of air coming into the engine is measured by the map sensor, which is determining how much pressure is actually in the manifold. That, combined with the computer's fueling calculations on the fuel sheets, is what it uses to determine roughly how much and how long the injector should be open. And then combined with what the O2 sensor is actually seeing for how rich or how lean the engine is actually running, it adjusts as needed. So that system should not ever be able to do something where it goes to wide open throttle, especially considering that the throttle body mechanism of that unit is tied directly to a mechanical spring that is tied to throttle linkage. So if the throttle is closed, the throttle butterflies are closed, there's no more air coming into that engine other than what the IACV or idle air controller is allowing to bypass the throttle plates. So with that in mind, the very first thing that came to my mind was the throttle was sticking open, which I didn't have to lift off the throttle pedal. So that meant it probably wasn't sticking open because it shouldn't have been able to close itself as soon as I went to neutral. So I went straight to the IACV. The idle air control valve must be letting too much air through, that making the engine run higher, which then means the O2 sensor is telling the computer it needs more fuel to get back to an optimum mixture, which then in turn tells the computer to dump more fuel, and then the circle continues until it revs too high. Seemed like a logical point to start. So I took some materials out to the shop with me, went out into the garage and taped over the IACV, which means that the IACV cannot pull any air in around the throttle plates. So if the car is set up correctly, then it should be barely able to idle in that condition, let alone race off and go uncontrolled. So we tape it off, I get in the car, I fire it up, Just to be safe, I let the car warm all the way up to operating temperature because I had a feeling it could still go wide open throttle, and I really don't want to round off the cam in this old flat tappet setup. Once it had been idling well, oil pressure looked good, everything, I shifted into drive and I touched the throttle. The first thing that happens when I touch the throttle, wide open and two huge black stripes out of the parking spot in the parking garage. Fortunately, I didn't bounce off the other retaining wall or end up somehow smashing through the wall into the street. I just managed to stop it about halfway out of the parking spot and back up. Now that's one of the other indicators that I had that this was a very unusual problem. In neutral and in park, if I revved the engine, nothing happens. If I moved back around in reverse, I didn't seem to have the problem, only in drive. So now we know the car goes wide open throttle for no apparent reason, only when the gas is barely touched, only in drive. So the very next questions that came to my mind is there some way air is getting into the system that isn't the IACV, but is somehow related to the transmission? So the transmission does have a hookup to it to where it pulls vacuum, or it has vacuum pulled on it to trigger the shifting mechanics of it. It allows it to know when it's gotten to a certain RPM to engage the shift point of the transmission. In theory, I have a air leak potential there, but I have no idea how that could actually come into play. So what I did is I went ahead and disconnected that, because obviously even if it's still the problem, I don't really want it shifting out of first anyway, because it'd be nice to at least only smash into a wall at 40 miles an hour as opposed to it shifting all the way up to 70. So I disconnected all the other vacuum sources from the engine, blocked that off, even capped off the PCV system and got that out of the mix so that it couldn't be adding any more air in, and tested the scenario again. And again, the car nearly tried to do a wheel stand coming out of the parking spot, as if it went from 0 to absolutely 100% throttle instantly. The unusual part for me in this is that it seemed to respond faster than whenever I actually put the pedal down. So I began to wonder if there was some sort of unusual problem with the TPS. So at this point, I'm diagnosing the IACV, I'm diagnosing the vacuum systems, I'm diagnosing the TPS sensor that actually measures the throttle position. But the issue I'm having is that with just my eyes, I can't watch all the sensor readings and keep the car from smashing into the wall of the parking garage while I'm testing all of this. So ultimately, what I had to have happen is I had to have my girlfriend come in with the camera and record what was on the screens and what was happening to the car when this situation occurred so that I could diagnose it. And the most useful piece of information came from a accidentally recorded section where it would have been a piece of video we couldn't actually have used online, because where she had positioned, she had kind of got a bad shot with a light in it and got startled by the car taking off, so it was all unstable. Generally not usable footage for what we could show online, but very diagnostically useful for our purposes in figuring out what was happening. So if you haven't guessed yet, the issue for this car was that one of the engine mounts, happening to be on the same side as the hard throttle linkage to the Sniper EFI unit, had broken loose. With this car being so tight, such stiff suspension, such a tight locker rear end, and having another motor mount that's holding it in place, as well as only about a inch or half-inch clearance to the hood at absolute max, what was happening was the car was taking off from the stop, the slack was being taken out of the drivetrain, and then that torque that was now going to the tires was also being exerted on the transmission and therefore the engine, causing the engine to turn up. Even though it could only turn up slightly, that was enough to open the throttle more, which then would cause it to open the throttle more and more as the torque increased. So with a slight input of the throttle, any amount enough to lift the engine off of the broken motor mount, it would wide open the throttle. But because everything was so tight, you didn't get a large clunk of an engine slopping around and you didn't get this crazy feeling of everything being out of position, because essentially it was just tipping up just enough to cause this problem. And when I finally was able to diagnose the problem, I actually ended up breaking other things because I had the hood open in that test in order to see what was happening. And when we opened the hood, the engine was now free to tip up much higher than it normally would, and smashed the radiator fan into the radiator shroud. It pulled things loose from the car, generally caused mayhem. So we figured out the problem, but we also caused a bunch of other problems with it. So right now I have just finished replacing the broken motor mounts. I went ahead and replaced the transmission mount because why not? And rather than replacing the mechanical fans that were on the engine, I went ahead and put electric fans on the car. So I'm going to use this as a chance to review some cheapo Amazon electric fans before my nicer Mishimoto aluminum radiator, matched fan, and thermostat get here. So you'll be able to see the difference between the performance of the old radiator with something off of Amazon that supposedly fits a 67 Mustang with cheap fans versus quality lifetime Mishimoto fans. So hopefully the diagnostic portion of this was of some value to you. If not, you can go ahead and dislike the video, but otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.